I'm Jasmine Al-Gamal, and this is The View from Here. It's been nearly 2 years since Hamas's October 7th attacks on Israel and Israel's subsequent response in Gaza. A response that has been declared by the International Association of Genocide Scholars to have met the legal definition of genocide. So for this week's episode, I sat down with two Israelis who have refused for different reasons to serve in the Israeli military. I asked them about their choice and what impact it's had on their lives, and I also asked them about what kind of conversations are happening inside of Israeli society now, both amongst Israelis and between Israelis and their government. I also asked them what message they had for policymakers. So you two haven't actually met before, but you both have one thing in common, which is actually something that's not very common in Israel right now, which is that you're both conscientious objectors. You've both refused to serve in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. Now, for listeners to know, whoever doesn't know this, IDF service is mandatory for Jewish and Druze citizens of Israel, both men and women, with some exceptions, of course. I think there are exceptions for women who are married or women who have had children. And there's a big exception, which is for religious community members, the ultra-Orthodox members in Israel, which has caused a lot of tension amongst Israelis and has even spilled over into Israeli politics. But we'll get to that in a bit. Now, as I was learning about this issue, and of course I've known about this for a while, Etan, you and I have talked about this before. Recent reasons for people refusing to join the IDF, I'm talking maybe in the last 3-4 years, have been a refusal to serve as a protest for Prime Minister Netanyahu's efforts to overhaul the judiciary. And then, of course, most recently, after the attacks of October 7th, in protest against Israeli actions in Gaza or other related reasons. But Etan, you refused to serve long before either of those two events happened. You refused to serve in the year 2001. And you're writing a book about the history of conscientious objection. So tell me your story. Tell us how that came about.
Yes, so first, thank you for having me. So first of all, yes, I'm old. I think, as you mentioned, there are a lot of reasons for people to refuse. Some protests of what's going on in the West Bank and Gaza. For me, it was a realization that Israeli society itself is serving the military and is militarized in turn. Instead of the military operating as an institution to sustain society, society itself is sustaining the military. So when I grew up in high school, there was a sense that we were prepared not for higher education, not for family, not for individual vocations, but to serve and to do what they called meaningful service, i.e. be in combat. That's what, especially in the school I was sent to. And I refused at a time where, I grew up in the 90s, right? With Oslo, peace with Jordan. There was a sense of hope, also for my parents who were activists. And this was shattered, first of all, by the assassination of Rabin, then after the collapse of Camp David and the Second Intifada started, it seemed that the hope we had were kind of an illusion. So I refused because of those reasons. I didn't see really a point of serving in an army that was not going to defend anything, but just kind of entrench this bloody status quo that we're seeing until today.
But, in a society where, as you said, everybody is expected to serve and you're raised on that notion, I can't imagine the courage it must have taken and how big that decision was. I mean, how old were you at the time when you decided to do this?
Around 17.
17 years old. Did you have examples of other people who were doing this? I mean, how did you even decide to make that decision?
First of all, my father was a conscious objector, is a conscious objector.
Wow, okay.
He actually served in the American Army during Vietnam, and he resigned over Vietnam. Ironically, he moved to Israel and served in the First Lebanon War as a new immigrant. It's kind of rite of passage. So I had that in my background, though, it was never implied that I would refuse. I mean, like I said, my father served in the Lebanon War as a truck driver. He did reserve duty until he was 40. And I was sent to a kibbutz where their ethos was this being in a combat unit to fight. That was kind of the ideal. And it was not much about courage. I don't think it really takes courage. I don't think I felt heroic. And if anything, I felt alienation. I felt kind of weird. Yeah, there's no path for anybody who doesn't serve in the army.
I didn't mean that you were heroic in the sense, I meant like it takes a lot of courage because not a lot of people, do that. I mean, that's a pretty big deal, especially back then.
Well, I think it goes both ways. I was sent to a military tribunal because of my beliefs. I did not even request it, but my record showed that I was already challenging that status quo. So, in terms of courage, I think that being able to make that decision wasn't something I even fully aware of at that point. You're also caught up in kind of a rebellion of youth, right? So it's all commingled together at to that moment, right? And you come out of it confused as well. So it took time for me to articulate what I didn't have the vocabulary at that time. So yeah, in terms of that courageous act, it was a set of circumstances that I really couldn't see any other option. And that final push, that final expressing that I would not serve still lingered for a long time.
So, did you go to jail?
I did not go to jail. So refusal is rare. And every case is very unique. Some people, they quietly let them go. Some people, the army wants to make them a symbol out of them, so they put them in jail. For me, again, my vocabulary of expressing the systematic malfunction or the criminal aspects or even stuff about the West Bank and occupation wasn't fully expressed back then. My vocabulary wasn't as wide as it now. So it was that decision at that moment. And the army, I don't know their reasoning. They released me, and the way they release you in the army is what they call Profile 21, which is mental health. So basically, to dissent in Israel is to be mad. So you're officially insane if you dissent. This thing, not only stigma, but actually in terms of benefits, in terms of jobs, in terms of your personal relationship, it follows you and follows me to this day.
Speaking of quiet refusal versus public refusal, I mean, Iddo, you have been very public in your refusal and very public in general over the last few months. In fact, the way I came across you was on social media because you showed up in my X feed and you were publicly and loudly talking about refusing and talking about your values and your morals and why you were refusing to serve in the military. And I mean, this is 24 years after Etan refused. First, I want to ask you, do you remember an exact moment when you made that decision in your head that you were explicitly going to refuse to serve?
For me, I think it all started by being born in the right family. I mean, all of my family is active politically and works in what we call leftist spaces. So when I was raised up, I was already raised on humanistic values. So by the age of 14 or so, it was COVID times. We had a lot of time at home. We weren't really studying at school. I started just researching activism, researching the occupation, just because I came across some stuff. And I joined a few protests against Netanyahu about his corruption cases. But then I met anti-occupation people there that were not just talking about the corruption of Netanyahu, but also the deep-rooted problems that we have in our country. I then joined leftist circles and activist circles against the occupation, in the end leading me also to the Mesarvot network for conscientious objectors. So by the age of 16, when I had my what we call the first draft or the first call, a day of mandatory tests and interviews at the enlistment base, I already knew refuse Nix and I already knew of the option to refuse. but haven't really decided whether or not I want to like do it quietly and try and get an exemption and avoid jail, or make that statement and make that move, which we do as activists, as conscientious objectors. But then at the personal interview at the army, I would say, she's like, the whole purpose of that day is to decide what unit are you going to do, what role are you going to do in the army. So she asked me like, oh, what do you want to do in the army? Like this 18-year-old soldier. And I told her, well, I don't want to join the army. And she was very confused by my answer, because out of all of the hundreds of people that she gets, she either gets people that want to do some kind of role in the army, or people playing it mad or trying to like prove to her that they are not fit to serve. So she asked me like, oh, what if we force you to go to the army? I told her, well, I still won't go to the army. And she said, even if you are sent to prison? And then I told her, yes. So from that point on, which was both my first interaction with the army system and my first like real time saying, I will refuse if I have to, I was just basically waiting already to be 18 to finally do it. So that was before October the 7th and before even the current like judicial reform. But obviously all of that stuff just for me amplified the need for me to take this decision.
For some reason, I thought that you had refused after October 7th. So you also had refused before October 7th.
So my official refusement and like being sent to jail and basically just my enlistment date was after October 7th in November 2024. But like since the age of 16, I already knew that it will be a part of my future. So I was just waiting for the actual date to enlist, or in my case, refuse.
And this is something I'm curious about just in terms of sort of personal, and I have these conversations a lot with Israelis that I meet, like especially younger ones. You're still young, Etan, don't worry. I'm not counting you as an older one. Did you grow up learning about things like the Nakba and like how Israel was created and like 1967 and the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza? Like, because you're both anti-occupation. I mean, you both talk about occupation, you talk about apartheid, you talk about rights for Palestinians, equal rights. Etan, you've been posting recently about the settler who was not held accountable for killing.
Yeah, the settler who killed Oda Hatzarin, Inon Levy.
And there was a picture of him smiling, and there was the headline was that he was basically not going to be punished for it. And you said something about that this was indicative of an entire system of impunity. So you both have been quite vocal in speaking out about this. Were you always taught about that, or is that something that you came into as you got older?
I think in a weird way, refusal put me on a path to learn more. And so I grew up, as I said, I grew up in the 90s. My parents, who still go to protests every week, they went on to peace protests, right? It was always about peace. And I was educated in a school on a kibbutz, as they said, which is, we did not learn about the Nakba. Not in a way that saying these people were expelled from the land. It was always couched in this war of independence, right? They had to flee, they fled. In terms of 67 occupation, yes. But again, it was occupation and there was peace, and peace would end occupation. It was very kind of flat and binary. And so when I refused, it was really to militarism in Israel and military society. And for me, it was less about what was the military doing to Palestinians, the system that is now entrenched, the system that dehumanized Palestinians and led to what we're seeing today, which was, I think, and we kind of talked about it before, but leading to this genocide that we're seeing. So there was a whole system in place. So funnily enough, when I refused, it was just because of how I saw my society. And once I was already marginalized, once I was already deemed as a refuser, once I left Israel, actually, I left Israel. I didn't want anything to do with Israel. I didn't want to be Israeli. And wherever I was in the globe, Israel kind of, not only Israel, but my story of refusal kind of, I bumped into it. And, a few years ago, I've been running for a while, but I would say in the past 8 or so years, I've been starting to write about refusal, about the place where I came from, about the society where I came from, and what led me to make the decision I made, and also what the military does to Israeli society. So,
Do you still feel that way? I mean, how do you feel now? Like, do you still feel that way about being Israeli, or was that a reactive, like, I don't, this is something I want to run away from? As you grew older, have you reconciled things inside of you?
so after I refused, we talked about there's no path for people who refuse the workforce and in many ways in society. I didn't have any other option. I started working construction. I worked in construction for about 5 years until I saved enough money and left. And I went to London first and went into university there just so I could not be in Israel. I didn't feel I could have roots there. And then I came to New York and meeting people, meeting other Israelis, meeting Palestinians. I feel, and obviously now I'm working as a correspondent for Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper. I feel much more Israeli and expressing the language that was so marginalized or even non-existent when I was there. So I feel kind of more Israeli now than ever before.
Yeah, I find that interesting. And I want to get Iddo's reaction too and his path, because I wonder, Iddo, as you were listening to Etan's story and kind of his journey in terms of whether it's identity or physical journey or everything that happened to him and that he was talking about, how close do you feel to him in terms of experiences, or has your experience just been completely different?
I like to go back to how I was brought up. I also didn't know anything about the Nakba or 67 or anything about the Palestinian narrative and Palestinian perspective of all the what I was taught were just wars in which all the Arab countries were against us and we like with the hand of God won. I was never taught that we won maybe because of Western help or maybe because many of these countries weren't actually that involved. And I was just taught that Jordan and the Palestinians and Egypt and Syria are basically just this one big thing. And this is even though I was brought up in Tel Aviv, which is supposed to be what we call in Israel like a leftist city. It's not really, but my parents very much brought me up with hands off. They didn't want to teach me, they didn't want me to be depressed already as a child. I celebrated Independence Day. I saw the army and the militarization in my society as normal. Only once I independently asked questions about the occupation, researched, and started being politically active, I kind of understood a lot of the answers that I was looking for. I mean, because it's really just like it's not a very good story what I was taught. I mean, I was just like taught like about miracles and like generalization of history. So I felt more Israeli, I think, as a child than I do now, but I do not denounce the fact that I'm an Israeli. I mean, it's just, for me, it's just a fact of reality. I am Israeli because that's where I was born and that's the country in my passport. That doesn't mean anything about my support or not support for its actions or my government. It just means, in the end of the day, that that's what I know. That's the only reality I know. I mean, I was just talking a few days ago with somebody about the fact that I miss this Israeli dream in which I grew up in. I mean, you know, society when I was growing up before like something drastically like October the 7th happened and before I actually knew anything was fun. I grew up listening to Israeli pop music and all the Israeli songs, seeing movies about wars and the army. Some of them are very humorous also. I loved being Israeli growing up and I loved celebrating that fact. But the moment I actually knew that most of it is an illusion and most of it is at least half a lie, I am just disillusioned. October the 7th, it was really a shock for all of us, I think, because that conception of which we can continue having fun and celebrating the fact that we're Israeli and listening to whatever music we want and doing whatever we want while continuing this occupation and suppression was just broken completely down. We all know people that are connected to the hostage families, connected to the kibbutzim that were either killed or family members of them were killed, and we cannot continue with the same mindset anymore, I think.
I'm very touched by what you said just now about missing that fairy tale narrative that you grew up with, because I feel like I can relate to that a little bit. My father was an immigrant to the United States, and I definitely grew up with this idea of the US as the shining city on the hill, and you know, it gave us everything we had and all the opportunities, and it's the best country. And I mean, it was all these things. And I remember kind of after 9/11, which probably if we had to compare, I mean, nothing is comparable, of course, in terms of life events or world events, but I find a lot of similarities between 9/11 and October 7th, not just in what happened, two fairly invincible or perceiving themselves to be invincible countries attacked suddenly by an enemy that they thought was completely incapable of doing something like that. And so the shock and the embarrassment, the humiliation, the revenge, and then also at the same time, what it did to the world, both October 7th and 9/11 changed the whole world because of who was attacked and what that victim that day did to the world and how it reacted. So I do see a lot of similarities. And so similarly, I think, Iddo, especially for you, like September 11th, I was 20 years old. I was like 19 or 20, and it was a wake-up call for me. My instinct, though, was to try to both serve my country and also to serve where I had come from, which is people in the Middle East and Muslim people who I knew were going to be attacked and targeted and dehumanized for what these people had done. And I served in government. I served in the Department of Defense. I was a civil servant. I was a political advisor with the intention of trying to make U.S. policy in the Middle East better as someone who understood the region. Now, since that time, I have had to grapple with whether or not that was the right decision and whether there is such a thing of making something better from the inside if the thing itself is doing so much damage. And I can't tell you that I've come to a conclusion. I mean, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, both of you, because I still believe in public service. And I still believe that if there are not good people in government and in the military, which, I mean, every country needs a military, then isn't that worse than if it was only staffed by people who had the wrong ideas? So, you know, I don't know. I mean, I'm curious where you guys have come out on. I mean, you obviously both made a decision not to be part of the system.
Yeah. I think, like, if I was a normal, let's say, Israeli, and if I haven't done my own research and my own political activism before I enlisted, and before October the 7th, I was in 12th grade in October the 7th, then I would feel the same. I would feel that revenge emotion and also the want to serve my country, because that is what we are brought up to think. I completely agree that we need to address our society where it's at, and we need good people in governance. But the moment I actually was in the West Bank for the first time and had Palestinian friends for the first time and was politically active for the first time, I mean, giving so much, and it's not a lot, but for me, like, you know, giving whole days to protests and organizing and stuff like that, and then seeing how your government, police, and army respond to it with disdain and completely disregard you as some traitor, even though you're just like, let's say, marching with water to a displaced community in the West Bank. I mean, why is water dangerous? I couldn't understand. Why am I treated this way? And I just couldn't bear with the fact that the system is. I just saw that the system is completely rotten from up top. I mean, here it's different from the US just because the occupation and the crimes we're making, like the United States committed crimes in its own wars, are literally next to us. So we have to we cannot, I think, change from within, but we can change our society from within, and we can put pressure. And the biggest thing we can do, I think, is put pressure on the military and our government to change its course and to act differently. And the biggest thing that I can do as an 18-year-old to put pressure is make it, make some extravagant step that the media has to talk about and people cannot ignore. And that's refusing here because we're so militarized. It's this big thing.
Well, I mean, it worked in the sense that I found out about you. So
yeah, exactly.
So that's good. I mean, Etan, is that why you became a writer and a journalist, or was that your way of trying to change things from the outside?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, it's funny, I think we kind of have a reverse story. I grew up in a small village near Haifa, a community mostly of immigrants, mostly older. And in our village, in my age group, there were one other kid. So I grew up in a place that felt very detached from the Israeli experience. So when I went to the regional school and there were, singing the national anthem and there were ceremonies every week and Memorial Day, and I always felt not alienated from it, but it wasn't, feeling Israeli wasn't never a part of me. I also grew up near Haifa, which at that time, I had mostly a lot of friends who just came from Soviet Union, a lot of, as in youth, we got into trouble. And these kids also ended up marginalized anyway. I mean, it felt like more than occupation, more than Palestinian, there was a face that Israeli society wanted to put out to the world and to itself. And all the kids that were not, part of that ethos were kind of marginalized. It's funny, I come from a Ukrainian heritage. I would go to Haifa. People would speak Russian to me. My father speaks Russian. I don't, unfortunately. At that time, it was kind of a shame to be associated with being Russian. So you grow up with this identity that's very fractured in a way because, your school, your society wants a certain image. And then I left. And as I said, I already was not feeling Israeli, but looking from the outside and looking kind of the big picture, I could see what it's doing, and seeing this kind of creeping normalization of occupation. So I don't know if it was more influence from the outside, me starting to write about it, but makes sense to me of where it came from and where the society was going. And I'll just note that my wife, who I met here in grad school, she was pregnant. She's doing a PhD. She had a year off for research. She wanted to go to Israel for the year to go with our families. And my instinct, I said no. I felt that Israel, something was about to happen. This was during the judicial overhaul. And my gut, I felt like there's going to be something horrible. And we had so many fights about it, like me saying, listen, I thought there was going to be a war with Hezbollah, Iran, something's gonna, I felt this bubbling that this is, like Iddo said, that painting of Israel society for the past decade and a half was going to explode. And it did on October 7th. And yeah, I mean, I think 2 years later, there's still Israelis have a hard time reckoning with that reality of how it was unsustainable and how it was. I mean, we're now marking 20 years of Gaza withdrawal that in hindsight was part of this foundation that created October 7th, that instead of talking about to stabilize the border, to give people safety, instead it was this kind of withdrawal, no plan. And Ariel Sharon put fences around the West Bank. And then there was all these right-wing philosophers like Micha Goodman who said, we can minimize the occupation. There was the Abraham Accord, which we can bypass any peace with Palestinians. And Israelis, we were educated that we could live with occupation, and for the people in the south, they could live with Qassam rockets every now and again. And for the Israeli society, we could live with around with Hezbollah every couple of years. And October 7th was that reality that kind of burst in the most violent and horrific way. And it's still ongoing because Israeli society has not begun reckoning, not with October 7th, but way before.
Gosh, there's so much to unpack here, but you've both talked about Israeli society in the last few minutes. And I wanted to ask you about that because obviously you're both Israeli. Etan, you're living outside of Israel. Iddo, obviously you're in Israel. But this idea of Israeli society, and there has been a lot of discussion, public discourse amongst academics, activists, people outside of Israel and inside of Israel about Israeli society and what it is and what it believes in and what's happening to it and who represents it. Because, and you've both mentioned this idea of this sort of fantasy, really, when you think about it, but a fantasy that went on for a long time, which is that you can live next to an occupied territory and go to the beach every weekend and party and go to festivals and everything's going to be fine. Now, I wonder, though, if the lesson is we just need to build higher fences, have a better military, expel the people who are occupied, never mind having occupied people next to us. Let's just not have any people next to us. Let's just take over the whole thing. And so on one hand, you see people like Iddo, who's been marching to the border and who's been protesting. You have people, more and more people, showing up in the streets. And whereas maybe before it was mostly about bring home the hostages, now it's about bring home the hostages, end the war, and stop starving Palestinians, and holding up pictures of Palestinian kids. So I do see that part of Israeli society. And I've met so many people in the last 2 years, peacemakers, people who are actively working to change the status quo in Israel and to change the occupation, the apartheid, all of that stuff. But then you read the polls. Again, as an outsider, 80% of Israelis want to see Gazans leave. The majority of Israelis are not that bothered by what's happening in Gaza. You read that stuff and you're like, well, what is happening? And then you hear people say, oh, it's because they don't know. They don't know the extent of it. But so then you're like, what? How do you not know? I mean, just pick up your phone, go on Facebook. There has to be an explicit willingness, I think, not to want to know, if that's your excuse, is that you don't know what's going on. And then lastly, I think we've also seen these really shocking and awful instances, not once, not twice, but really a trend of young Israeli soldiers filming themselves in, Palestinian women's clothes, Lebanese women's clothes, making TikToks. So I know you can't speak for all of Israeli society, obviously, but what is happening inside of Israeli society? What is representative? And that reckoning that you're talking about, Etan, is that reckoning coming about what kind of society this is and where it's going?
So last week I was talking to a director, Russian-American, who did a documentary about the last independent media outlet in Russia before the war, before they went into exile and closed down after the Ukraine war. And she said she hasn't been there since, but she's talking to a friend in Moscow, and he's talking that there are parties every week, that gallery openings, that people are rationalizing to themselves. They're saying, well, we can't go to Europe, but we're going to make Moscow, a party town. We're going to make St. Petersburg a party town. I think what's happening with Israeli society is the same in every society that's over-militarized, that is radicalized to a point where, as you said, there's enough evidence, there's enough footage of starving Palestinians, of dead babies. There's a mechanism of denial, not only in the media, in Israeli media, and we can talk about that a bit, but how society justifies its existence. So instead of reckoning, there is this doubling down. And we're seeing that in Russia with Putin, 500,000 soldiers have died, Russian soldiers. And still, Russians are living with it, or many of them, especially in the media, are doubling down, not asking where this war going and why. And I think the insistence talking about Israeli society as opposed to Zionism, which has been kind of that replacement word. Israeli society has its own unique situation with Palestinians, but it's like any other society. Just for example, a year ago I wrote about a torture case in Israel of Palestinian prisoners being tortured. And there was a discourse on Israeli media about whether you support torture or not, which was, to a lot of people, this was disgusting. How can Israelis be like this? And I did some research and I found a poll from around 2016 about American support for torture of terrorists. And according to the poll, almost 2/3 were supporting of torture. So I think every society is susceptible to this. I think in Israel, and especially since October 7th, it has gone to the extreme of this denial, this justification, and these mechanisms are the elements that can cause the most horrendous and horrible things. First of all, when you deny and then you rationalize, I think those are this kind of mix that causes society to do horrors. And we see that in Russia, we see that in Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia is also a great example. After Milosevic was extradited to The Hague, not for war crimes, but for corruption, then people start to find out the horror Serbians did in Bosnia. Until then, there was this curtain of denial and propaganda and justification.
A couple of things here came up when you were talking. I mean, one obviously is the impact of a traumatic event on the radicalization of a society. Now, of course, things like torture of Palestinian prisoners, occupation, all of that stuff, that predates October 7th. But I wonder, Iddo, how much October 7th you feel and the trauma of that day pushed people in a direction that you had previously, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I wonder if you thought that had an impact. And let's just talk about that first, because I've always pushed back on the idea that any society was uniquely in some way capable of doing something or the other. Look at throughout history. I mean, this is a human problem. Human beings are capable of horrible things. Now, of course, you're right. It is magnified when you're living in a society that is overly militarized, in a society whose creation was grounded in militarization and securitization. You could say the same for the US as well and other countries. So there are factors, but at the end of the day, it's really about human beings and what human beings are capable of if they're put in certain circumstances. But of course, the magnifying glass now, so to speak, is on Israeli society because of the horrors of what we're seeing in Gaza, because we're seeing what is now widely regarded by human rights experts, genocide experts, Israeli genocide experts as a genocide, and it's live streamed. And then you're comparing it, side by side with images of or stories of people on the beach or dancing a few miles away. And it's hard to reconcile those two things. And I think people just want to understand, what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, I would start by saying, you can continue celebrating, going to the beach, drinking, having fun, while your country commits war crime and you have occupation, as long as you're willing to accept that every now and then many people will die and many people will suffer, but you can. I mean, technically you can continue on with this trend, but it will just make more October the 7th and more wars and more need of soldiers to die on the front. I think like it's really difficult living now in Israel because October the 7th for me was, like I said, I mean, proof that this doesn't work. But for many, it was the opposite. I mean, it basically proved that Palestinians are animals and that the peace movement and the peace prospect is dead. Not that we have killed it because Netanyahu has been in government for so many years now trying to kill it. So Israeli society, I mean, right after October the 7th, completely went right-wing and dehumanized the Palestinians and justified going to war completely. The feeling of revenge after something like October the 7th, I think, is understandable on a human level, not maybe a moral level, but a human level. But like the amount of people that I used to respect, I used to at least think a bit more highly of, that completely decided to be for the annihilation of Gaza and call for the annihilation of Gaza, or at least for like an eye for an eye, is very high. And like we said, I mean, before October the 7th, we are already been saying that the occupation will result in more death on our side as well, and will result in something like this. And throughout this genocide or war in general, we have been seeing many Israelis waking up bit by bit to the fact that maybe this war does not serve them, and maybe sending their children to die in Gaza is not something that they should be for. And like you said, the struggle to bring back the hostages has evolved into also stopping the war and now also talking about starvation. But for a large chunk of our society, seeing like one fake video or one like fake report about the fact that the starvation is not real, or about the fact that Hamas steals all the food and we cannot do anything about it, that will for them dismantle all Palestinian claims. I mean, we just saw this like article coming out of Germany talking about the fact that like this photographer staged a photo. In reality, he did not stage it, and it was just like at a distribution point while the food was not present, but it was present a bit before or a bit after, like we saw in other pictures. But that was like peddled by all parts of government, even our president. And that is what Israelis see, like, oh, if there's no starvation, then maybe everything is fine. And if there is starvation, then it's Hamas' fault. And if there is like killings, then the Israeli government will say, oh, it's the best ratio out of all urban warfare. I have no idea where they get this notion. And even if it's the best ratio, can't we just see human suffering for what it is? And one of the things that we on the left did start doing is holding the pictures of the starved Palestinian children and also the dead Palestinian children in the streets, because you can protest all you want, but we have to just try and break the barrier of it's not that they don't know, it's disillusion and misinformation and twisting of the facts that is plaguing our society. So just seeing a picture of a baby that was once alive and now is dead because of us, that is the way, I think, to start and change people's minds. And we really need to just focus on the humanistic aspect of it, because I do think many Israelis can relate to that, even if they disagree with us and even if they still send their children to fight. But it's really hard. It's really, really hard, because even mainstream news, which sometimes talk about starvation, sometimes call for the end of the war, sometimes even show a bit of suffering of the Palestinian people, but not a lot. Even they, once we refuse and they cover our protests or our refusal, treat us as traitors and say, oh, well, even if there is starvation, even if there are some bad apples, it's not the system's fault, and it's not the country's fault, and it's not society's fault. It's only like a few people. And I think we have to stop like blaming people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, while a large chunk of our society voted for them, a large chunk of our society still supports them, and a large chunk of our society does not support them, see them as bad apples, but do not actually do anything about it, do not actually go onto the street and point out the war crimes that they are pushing. Because why is nobody, like the anti-Netanyahu crowd, I think, just needs to get on this point. I mean, Netanyahu needs to go, not only because he's corrupt, not only because he's trying to pass judicial reform and trying to like undermine democracy. Talk about the war crimes he's committed. You don't have to be on his side. You don't have to support his Iranian war, for example, that he started for no other reason either than to like political credit. All of his opposition supported that war, for example. I think we have to attack his positions and the government's positions on all fronts, and especially on the Gazan front, because what they're committing internationally is now called a genocide, and Israeli society needs to say it now and not in 5, 10, 15 years when it's more acceptable.
I do understand when I talk to people and they say this war is still October 7th to us because our hostages are still not back. And so I get that, and I get that open-endedness of it, especially because Israel is such a small country. And as you said, Iddo, everyone knows someone who is either a hostage family member or is close to them. Everyone's affected in a way. So I do understand that. But what I worry about is that we're going to have two opposing ideas of how to reckon with everything that's happened and how to move forward. One is Iddo and you and people who think like you, and one is the doubling down, you know, in order to make sure that the cost is not a war every few years or hostage taken every few years. Then we just need to get rid of them all and we need to destroy them. I want to get your reaction to what does occupation of Gaza mean to you as Israelis? Smotrich and Ben Gvir, these two extremist ministers in the Israeli government, they have been saying all along that this was the plan. And everyone from journalists to pundits to government officials in the West blew it off as these are just extremists, these are fringe, oh, they're crazy, don't worry about what they're saying. When we could see day by day, step by step, decision by decision, that everything they were saying was being done by Netanyahu and was being put into practice, not only in Gaza, but in the West Bank. So just to sort of bring us home, tell me, I want to talk about today and what is about to potentially happen and what you think it means.
I did not live through the settlements in Gaza and that time period, so maybe I'm more disconnected from a lot of Israelis. But in my opinion, and from what I see in the West Bank, the settlers, they are actually doing it because it's their like messianic mission to have all of Israel from the river to the sea, and even more Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and parts of Egypt even. But whether or not we're talking about the religious regions for that, they do not see Palestinians as equal human beings. They do not see them as human beings that deserve self-determination, equality, dignity. So sending these guys and people that do not respect Palestinian people, do not recognize Palestinians into parts who are completely Palestinians like Gaza is obviously a provocation and a step in the wrong direction, and not like something that will stop the next 7th of October. And like, I don't want the next 7th of October to be on the settlers. It's not that I want them to protect me. I want all people from the river to the sea to have security, and I can only see that happening if everybody can live with dignity and respect. because it's 20 years since we took all the settlers out, a lot has been popping up in my feed on social media and on the news about like the trauma of the displacement of the settlers. And maybe because I haven't lived through that, but it seems completely propagandist and insane to me to talk about what happened 20 years ago to a few thousand people who knowingly went into what you can call enemy territory to live under threat. Nobody asked them to do this. And to talk about that instead of the millions who are being displaced right now out of their place that they have been for decades, not like for a few years. It's insane. It's insane to me to like try and even be sympathetic to this story that I'm being told about like how officers, military personnel were crying while displacing these settlers. Because this is so dangerous, in my opinion, to talk about this as like they try and to talk about this in a sympathetic, humanistic way, even though their leadership, at least, not everybody, but their leadership is completely fascistic and dehumanizing and messianic and religious fundamentalist. And we cannot, as I think, you know, sane people in general, humanistic people, but everybody from leftists to liberals also, we cannot talk about this without recognizing how it's insane that our government and a lot of our society is basically just supporting an oppression of a whole people because they have brought this on themselves. Like, even if Hamas did what, like, it doesn't matter. I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about millions of people as a monolith and as something that is like one thing, even though each and every one of them is a human being. And the most important thing for me is both that international people and Israelis start realizing that, like, we are not want to be treated the same, and we do not want to be, you know, what we now is being called like the anti-Semitic attacks against Israelis all over the world. Like, we are not accepting that. We shouldn't accept the generalization of all the Palestinian people.
Iddo, do you think if Gaza is reoccupied, that you will see more people refuse to serve in the military to go actually carry out that occupation?
I think it will definitely help in this direction of more refuseniks. I mean, there are not a lot of refuseniks, but since October the 7th till now, it has been more than usual, at least. I mean, just like last week, 2 young 18-year-old friends went to prison. Next week, another refusenik. And it is growing. And I think a lot of young people at the ages of 18 now need that one extra push because they're still in this Israeli mindset that the military is mandatory, and their parents are pressuring them, and their friends are pressuring them, and their teachers are pressuring them. And they need that extra push. Not only are we killing the hostages, not only are we committing war crimes, our government is also ensuring that the next generation will do the same, and the next generation will suffer more. We need to be populists, I think, a bit, and talk with Israeli youth where they're at, that this is insane at this point. Even if you want to serve our country, even if you want to serve in the military, even if you're having all of this pressure on you, you have to recognize that we need to change course, and you have to recognize that if we are not changing course now, more people will die, more soldiers will die, more hostages will be taken, and more people will be killed. And we need to put all the pressure now instead of later, because later, like I said, will just result in more suffering. We're trying to do it, and I think it is starting to work, and hopefully it will grow and grow to the point of, you know, the breaking point, basically, where the army has to do something with us at least.
So you intend to keep doing this, Iddo?
I intend to continue supporting all refuseniks in the future and continue pushing for young people to have critical thinking, have second thoughts about everything, and know more about the occupation. If more young people at least think twice before like signing the papers, then we'll see more people just getting exemptions, more people disillusioned with their army service. And it's small things that push their parents and friends and people around them towards this direction as well. And we can only change it at the end of the day, the people that know us personally and in our surrounding. We cannot actually pressure Bibi out of this war. We can only pressure more young people and join us, basically.
Do you ever worry what might happen to you if you continue to do this and you continue to speak out? And I mean, even just doing this podcast, this conversation, I mean, when this comes out, are you worried about what the reaction might be?
I would say that, I mean, yes. I don't like to get in the specifics because I don't want to give power to anybody over me or over my feelings or like, you know, but we are getting daily threats, death threats, hate online in the streets when we protest. I mean, at this point, it's just the norm for leftists and anti-occupation folks getting hate. It's scary, it's stressful. I would say that daily life has become extremely stressful in general because a lot of my time is given towards activism, but it's the only thing that I can see that can keep me here. I mean, if I'm not an activist, if I'm not doing anything to stop the genocide, to stop the occupation, in my opinion, I should just leave this place. If I'm not like seeking a better future for Palestinians and choose between the river and the sea, whatever we call it, and just the stop of the genocide. If I'm not seeking that, then I shouldn't stay here. I don't have a reason to stay here. And I want to stay here. This is my only home, the only place that I know, the only culture and people that I know. I have family, friends that I have known for a long time that live here. And I cannot see myself living in any other place. Like most people, Palestinians and Jews, cannot see themselves being displaced. So I just have to do whatever I can, even though it's stressful. And I think it's a small price to pay compared to the price of a newborn in Gaza that is born into this situation and has never experienced anything else.
I don't want to say it's impressive what you're doing because that's like totally the wrong word. It is very, very courageous. And I think when history is written about this period of time, people like you are going to be in it in the best kind of way. How about you, Etan? I mean, what is this occupation, reoccupation, if it actually happens, given everything you've described about the first one, the fact that you lived it? What does this mean to you now, coming full circle 20 years later?
Hamas leader or jihad leader was assassinated by Air Force, and his family died with him. And I think more like between 30 and 50 pilots sent a letter that they would not fly assassination missions if it would endanger citizens. Now they're doing it without batting an eye. Hundreds of, tens of thousands every day flying missions under a government the day before October 7th were protesting and threatening not to serve under. So I think reoccupying of Gaza, especially with the hostages, this means their death sentence. This means that anybody who's talking about bringing back the hostages but does not talk about what this step will do, this officially means Israel has ceased to exist as a operation with civil society in it.
Well, and also, Etan, everything that you're talking about and that social contract has been borne by a few, because a large portion of Israeli society, the ultra-Orthodox, the ultra-religious, are exempt from bearing that burden. So you're talking about a bigger burden borne by people who have been, doing deployments again and again and again, because a portion of Israeli society is completely exempt from that. So I think, that in my understanding is that is something that would strain that social contract and Israeli society even more.
We're already seeing, because the refusal is so rare, and we're seeing in the past month between 7 and 10 soldiers committing suicide, right? Because of either the mental strain from what they ordered to do, from what they did. This last resort means, again, that kind of reckoning, right? The burden is on liberal society, or a society that wants to be liberal, that's aspirationally liberal, right? The ultra-Orthodox are in their own bubble, and because of some political constellations, they have power. I refuse to believe it's, that the subset that they do not serve is in any way that thing that is straining liberal society. It's strained because of occupation, because of the ongoing war, and it will continue and escalate with the reoccupation of Gaza.
Iddo, I mean, given everything that you've told me and everything that you've seen and gone through, what message do you have for policymakers, whether they be Israeli policymakers or policymakers in the US and other Western countries who have supported this Israeli government, the Netanyahu government, unequivocally for the last 2 years almost now?
My message to international policymakers and audiences is different from my message to Israeli ones. I don't really have a clear message for my own government and coalition right now because I see them as despicable war criminals, a lot of them, and I think a lot of them do not want to hear what I have to say or any young refusenik, any young dissident has to say. But for the opposition of Netanyahu, the mainstream opposition of Netanyahu, my main message is stop trying to be the next Netanyahu. Stop trying to be a different version of the same thing. They have to start seeing Palestinians and the Palestinian question and the question in general about equality here differently, because if they are not offering anything about the Palestinians and about the conflict and about, in general, the occupation and wars, then I do not want to hear them out. I do not see them as any different. My message to international policymakers is to stop supporting Netanyahu and to stop supporting my government. Like, we're closing in on 2 years into this genocide. I think it's obvious at this point to many policymakers and many leaders that it's wrong. We're seeing condemnations, but we are not seeing actions. We have to stop giving aid and the money that is fueling this genocide, because even if it's defensive aid, even if it's like supposed to be only this or that, every bit of aid and money now contributes as offensive right now and is helping Netanyahu continue doing what he does. I want policymakers in the United States to speak with us, speak with young people from Palestine and Israel who are building a coalition together, who are building a better future, working together, Jews and Palestinians, to speak with us and listen to us, because if they don't listen to the peace voice and the young voice here, then the only people that they have to listen to is, like I said, the opposition and the coalition, who are not that different, in my opinion, at least not on the parts that matter. That's it, I think. And yeah, just we have to stop it now, I think. We have to do everything.
Right. I would say to them to treat Israeli society like you did before October 7th, when millions took to the streets in protest of this same government that was tearing the social contract of Israel, that was with occupation and with subjugating of Palestinian. On top of that, were tearing apart the social contract, were basically calling for war against the judiciary to make Israel an illiberal and, eventually an autocratic state. October 7th changed many things, but the reality is still the same. There's still the same forces that are governing. I know there's no real sympathy for Palestinians in American leadership, besides a few lone voices. And no, America has not been the honest broker it claims to have been. So, if you want to have this special relation with Israel, to flaunt Israel as your liberal ally in the region, listen to the people who took to the streets. Listen to the people who have called for a hostage deal 4 months after the start of the war. They are the majority. Listen to hostage families who are basically just are calling for the government to uphold its end of the bargain, right? Every citizen should be defended by and protected by the government and by the military. On October 7th, the government and the military failed on both sides. And this is not because of Hamas. Hamas was always a known factor. Hamas was a known factor for 30 years. Israeli and the military failed because it never wanted to decide where the border was. And in this, it's been sacrificing its citizens and soldiers for decades, and especially in the past 20 years. So I would tell policymakers to listen to civil society. We need the end of the war, and we need this government to go away. I'm very realistic. I don't see any radical change happening, but we are at this real breaking point. I mean, the Palestinian population, Gaza, is already past this watershed moment. The impact of this war, even if it stopped today, would be for generations. Generations of families have been erased. 90% of Gaza is decimated. Stop before Israeli society will be sacrificed for the goals of the few radical right-wingers who are currently in power. That's my message for policymakers.
Well, I've taken up enough of your time. Thank you so much for being so generous tonight and for talking to me for this long. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Jasmine.
Thank you.
I hope you found that conversation informative. If you'd like to help us get more of these conversations out there, please don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, subscribe to our YouTube videos, and leave us a review or a comment to let us know what you're thinking. You can also always email us at jasmine@viewfromherepod.com. That's jasmine@viewfromherepod.com. As always, thank you so much for listening. I'm Jasmine El Gamal, and this is The View From Here.